God sent the flood for one reason. One specific, deliberate, surgical reason. Not to punish human wickedness in a general sense. Not to reset a civilization that had grown too comfortable. Those are the answers most people carry out of childhood. They are not entirely wrong, but they are dangerously incomplete. He sent the flood to erase them. Every last one. The Nephilim, the beings who had crossed the boundary that was never supposed to be crossed, who had rewritten the biological order of the ancient world, had to be removed from the earth. Completely. Permanently. Without remainder. Genesis 6 is not subtle about this. The text does not soften the language. The sons of God had come down to the daughters of men. What they produced together had contaminated the world at a level the text describes with a single Hebrew word, shashit. Corruption so deep it reaches the foundation. The kind that does not respond to instruction or consequence or time. The only cure was water. All of it. Enough to cover the mountains. Enough to leave nothing breathing. 40 days of rain. 150 days of water standing over the face of the earth. And when it finally receded, when the ark settled on Arad and the survivors stepped out into a world that smelled of silence and mud and beginning, the Nephilim were gone. That was the settled truth. The chapter had been closed. Sealed. Buried under the weight of the most catastrophic event in human memory. 400 years later, 12 men walked into the hill country of Canaan and found them waiting. There is a sentence in Genesis 6 that most people read and move past too quickly. It sits in verse 4, right in the middle of the passage about the Nephilim, between two much larger statements about the sons of God and the heroes of the ancient world. 3 words. In English they read simply, and also afterward. Small. Quiet. Easy to absorb into the general meaning of the passage without stopping. Easy to treat as a grammatical remnant rather than a theological declaration. But in the original Hebrew, the phrase is wegam acharei-ken. It is deliberate, precise. The kind of phrasing that ancient scribal tradition used when it needed to say something specific, something that had to be in the text, even if the reader was not yet ready to hear it. And also afterward. After what? After the flood. The text is saying, in the most controlled possible language, that the Nephilim were on the earth before the flood and also afterward. That the water did not end everything it was sent to end. 3 words. Placed quietly in the middle of a verse. And in those 3 words, the entire mystery of what the 12 spies found in Canaan begins. Because here is the question that 3,000 years of scripture commentary have never fully answered. How? If the flood was designed specifically to remove this contamination from the earth, if the waters rose precisely because of what the Nephilim represented, then how did their descendants end up standing in the highlands of Canaan, watching 12 frightened men from the plains below? The answer exists. It is preserved in a text that was once read alongside Genesis in the earliest Jewish and Christian communities. A text that was quoted directly by the New Testament in the letter of Jude, verses 14 and 15, where Enoch himself is named and cited. a text that was eventually removed from the official canon. Quietly, at a council of church leaders in Laodicea in the 4th century, and left out of every Bible printed since. The Book of Enoch. What Enoch records about the fate of the Nephilim after the flood does not contradict Genesis. It completes it. It fills in the space that Genesis deliberately leaves open. The space between the flood and the highlands of Hebron. The space between the closed chapter and the one that reopened without warning. And it begins not with bodies, but with what happens to them after the bodies die. First Enoch, chapter 15, verse 8. The text is direct. It does not hedge. And now, the giants, who were produced from the spirits and flesh, shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling. Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies, because they are born from men, and from the holy watchers is their beginning and primal origin. Read that again. Take it apart. The Nephilim were offspring of two things that were never supposed to combine. The spiritual, the watchers, the sons of God, beings of a different order entirely. And the physical, the daughters of men, human women made of earth and blood and breath. When those hybrid bodies died, what happened to the spirit inside them? It could not ascend. It had no pathway back to heaven. It was not fully spiritual. It was not fully human. It was something in between. Something the architecture of the cosmos had no category for. Something that the laws governing both worlds left unaddressed. So it stayed. On the earth. In the earth. In the spaces between things. This is what Enoch records. The physical Nephilim died in the flood. The enormous bodies that had walked through the antediluvian world that had consumed everything a pre-flood civilization could produce and still hungered, those bodies sank beneath the water and were swallowed by the dark. But the spirits did not drown. They wandered the post-flood earth. Displaced. Restless. Looking for ways to express what their physical forms had always been: the hunger for domination, for control, for the consumption of what was not theirs to take. Looking for flesh to work through. Looking for bloodlines to inhabit. Now follow what the text itself records, not Enoch, but the canonical scripture. Because here is what we know from Numbers alone, without the supplementary tradition. Numbers 13:22. The 12 spies enter the region of Hebron, and they encounter 3 men. Named. Specific. Ahiman, Shishai, and Talmai. These are not anonymous all warriors. They are identified individuals. They have a lineage. They are described as the children of Enoch. And Enoch is described as the son of Arba. Arba. A name that means simply the Great One. A man so significant, so definitionally large in the memory of the region, that the ancient city of Hebron still carried his name. Kiriath Arba. The city of Arba. Joshua 14 will later record that Arba was the greatest man among the Anakites, a title, a descriptor, a fact, recorded with the same weight as a royal lineage. Who was Arba? Where did he come from? The text does not say. He appears in the record fully formed. A patriarch. A founder. A man of such stature and such significance that a major city was named after him. That his descendants occupied the highland territories of Canaan for generations. That the mere report of their existence was enough to paralyze a nation for 40 years. And no origin story. In a text as genealogically precise as the Hebrew Bible, in a tradition that traces ancestry with obsessive care, that records the generations from Adam to Noah and from Noah to Abraham and from Abraham to every tribe of Israel, the father of the Anakim has no parents. He simply appears in Hebron, in the land of the covenant. Impossibly large. This is not an accident of documentation. Ancient scribal tradition does not accidentally omit genealogy from significant figures. The absence is deliberate. The absence is a message. And that message says, you do not want to know where this man came from. Or perhaps more precisely, you already know. You have known since Genesis 6. Since those 3 words. Since and also afterward. Now follow the geography. Hebron is not a random location. Not a frontier city. Not an outpost at the edge of the wilderness. Hebron was where Abraham had pitched his tent. Where he had buried Sarah in the cave of Machpelah. Where he himself had been buried. Where Isaac was buried. Where Jacob was buried. The patriarchal heartland. The physical place where the covenant between God and Israel had taken deepest root. And the descendants of those who should not exist were living there. This is not background information. In the theological architecture of the Hebrew Bible, this is a statement, a challenge, a declaration. The promise was made here. And we are still here. Think about what that meant for the 12 scouts standing at the base of those walls. They were not simply confronting a military obstacle. They were confronting a theological fact. A living contradiction. A bloodline that said, by its very existence, by its occupation of this specific land, the flood did not finish what it started. And the word they reached for, the word that 10 of the 12 chose when they gave their report, was not tall men or warriors of great stature or formidable opponents. They said Nephilim. They reached back across centuries of settled theological history and pulled out the most cosmically charged word in the entire pre-flood vocabulary. Not because it was the most accurate military descriptor, but because it was the only word that communicated the true quality of what they had encountered. Not a tactical problem. A theological one. Not a city that needed to be taken. A fact that should not be possible. The walls of the Anakim did not break the 10 scouts. The word they chose to describe those walls did. Before we follow the bloodline to its final expression, before we arrive at the name you already know is waiting at the end of this genealogy, there is a king we have to meet first. Because the Anakim of Hebron represent one branch of the post-flood giant lineage. The branch that embedded itself in the highlands of Canaan. The branch that made its home in the covenant land and waited. This king represents the other branch. The one that built a kingdom. His name was Og, king of Bashan. Deuteronomy 3:11. Read the verse carefully. It records a single physical detail about this man with an attention to specifics that the surrounding text does not lavish on anyone else. His bed, his iron bed, was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. By modern measurement, approximately 13.5 feet long and 6 feet wide. An iron bed. Not wood, not stone. Iron. Forged to a specific dimension. And then preserved after Og himself was dead as an artifact in the city of Rabbah. A relic. A monument. Displayed the way a civilization displays something it wants future generations to remember. Or to believe. The text does not explain why they kept it. It simply records the fact. His iron bed is still in Rabbah of the Ammonites. 9 cubits long. 4 cubits wide. Consider the geometry of a 13.5-foot bed. Think about the man who required it. Og was called the last of the Rephaim. That is the specific identification Deuteronomy applies to him. The Rephaim, another name, another branch, another expression of the same post-flood lineage that had produced the Anakim of Hebron. They had occupied the territory east of the Jordan, the kingdom of Bashan. 60 cities, all fortified, all built to a scale that communicated the same message the walls of Hebron had communicated to the 12 spies. We are not the same category as you. When Moses and the Israelites defeated Og before they ever crossed the Jordan, when they took those 60 fortified cities and the plains of Bashan, the victory is recorded in Deuteronomy with a kind of retrospective awe. Moses is speaking to the second generation, 40 years later. He is telling them what stood between their parents and their inheritance. He wants them to understand what they almost didn't survive. And then the Jordan was crossed. And Caleb, one of the original 12, the one who had given the minority report at Kadesh Barnea 45 years earlier, the one who had stood before the assembly and said the land is good. The God who opened the Red Sea can handle a fortified city. Caleb walked to Joshua. He was 85 years old. 85 years old. And he said, "Give me the hill country. Give me Hebron, the city of Arba, the city where the sons of Enoch have been watching from the ramparts since before the day the 12 of us stood at the base of those walls and 10 of my brothers chose the word grasshopper. Give me the hardest thing on the map." He took it. He drove out Ahiman and Shishai and Talmai, the 3 sons of Enoch who had been waiting in Hebron. The 3 names recorded in Numbers 13. The 3 men whose existence had been cited as proof that a generation of Israelites could not enter their inheritance. He drove them out. Not at 38. Not at the moment of his maximum physical capacity. At 85. After 40 years of watching Egypt die out of the people he had been called to lead. After 40 years of patience, so costly it should have its own word. He drove out the sons of Enoch and planted his flag in the ground where the covenant had first been spoken. But they did not die in Hebron. The text tracks where they went. Gaza, Ashdod, Gath. 3 Philistine cities on the coastal plain. 3 places where the displaced remnant of the Anakim took root after the highlands fell. 3 cities where the bloodline embedded itself into Philistine culture and disappeared from the main narrative. Or appeared to disappear. Because a bloodline that survived a flood, a conquest, a wilderness, and a direct military campaign by an 85-year-old man with a divine mandate does not simply disappear. It goes quiet. It waits. It produces, in its own time, one final representative. One last figure to step out of the shadow of the lineage and walk into the center of the story. From the city of Gath. His name was Goliath. 1 Samuel 17, verse 4. His height is recorded, 6 cubits and a span. By modern measurement, approximately 9 feet and 9 inches. A warrior. A champion. The designated representative of the Philistine army. Sent into the valley of Elah to stand between 2 nations and settle the question of whose God was actually present. He stood there for 40 days. 40 days. The same number as the flood. The same number as the spies' journey into Canaan. That repetition is not accidental in a text this deliberately constructed. 40 is the number of threshold. The number of transformation. The number that measures the space between what was and what must be. For 40 days, the last expression of the Nephilim bloodline called out to Israel. And Israel stood on one side of the valley and looked across and gave the grasshopper answer. The same answer the scouts had given 400 years earlier. Not in words. In silence. In the specific, heavy silence of people who have looked at something and calculated that it is larger than they are allowed to handle. For 40 days, no one crossed the valley. And then a boy arrived with lunch for his brothers. He had no military training. No siege experience. No inherited memory of standing at the base of walls that scraped the sky and feeling the specific cold of that shadow. He came from Bethlehem. He tended sheep. He had killed a lion and a bear with his hands in the fields outside the city. Not because he had been trained to do it, but because the sheep were his responsibility and the lion had come for the sheep. He looked across the valley. He did not see a theological impossibility. He did not see a living proof that the flood had failed to accomplish what it was sent to accomplish. He did not see the culmination of a bloodline that stretched back before recorded human history to a transgression committed in a world that no longer existed. He saw an uncircumcised Philistine who was defying the armies of the living God. He picked up 5 smooth stones from the brook. He fitted one into the sling he had used for years in the fields around Bethlehem. He crossed the valley. And the bloodline of the Watchers ended in the dust. Hold that image for a moment. The stone leaving the sling. The giant falling. The valley going quiet. Hold it not as a triumph not yet, but as a question. What made David able to cross a valley that an entire army had spent 40 days staring across? The obvious answer is faith. And that answer is not wrong. But it is incomplete in the same way that punishment is an incomplete description of the flood. It is the first layer. There are layers beneath it. Here's what the full arc of this history reveals. The 12 spies were not broken by the size of the Anakim. They were broken by what the Anakim represented, by the theological implication of their existence, by the discovery that the chapter everyone thought was closed, the chapter sealed by 40 days of rain and 150 days of water, had somehow remained open. The grasshopper was not a description of their physical size relative to the warriors of Hebron. It was a description of their self-concept relative to what the task actually required. And here's the layer beneath even that. The generation of Egypt had been calibrated. 400 years of slavery installs something in the human being that freedom cannot automatically undo. It installs a set of internal measurements, a set of invisible but structurally solid limitations on what is possible, on what is permitted to be imagined, on what horizon is appropriate for people of a specific kind. Egypt had told them, at a level below language, below conscious thought, below the reach of miracles, you are the size of your chains. The Red Sea had opened. The manna had fallen. The water had come from the rock. And still the program ran. Because the program was not installed by one event. It was installed by 400 years of daily reinforcement. 400 years of waking up and being told, before breakfast, what you were worth. You do not undo 400 years with one sea crossing. But you can undo it with 40 years. 40 years of being nobody's property. 40 years of eating bread that came from the sky and drinking water that came from stone. 40 years of daily, patient, expensive evidence that the God of Israel was not the God of Egypt. That the ceiling was not where Egypt had installed it. That the horizon was not where the brick pits ended. 40 years of slowly, one generation at a time, one death at a time, letting the Egyptian calibration fade from living memory. The children of the grasshoppers did not cross the Jordan because they were physically superior to their parents. They were not. They did not cross it because they had better weapons or superior strategy or more favorable conditions. The walls of Canaan were still there. The descendants of Enoch were still in Gaza and Ashdod and Gath. The scale asymmetry was still real. They crossed it because they had never been told, at a cellular level, what they were not supposed to be able to do. They had no Egypt running underneath their conscious thought like an installation they had never chosen and could not simply delete with willpower. And David had even less of it than they did. David grew up in Bethlehem. Not in the wilderness. Not in the shadow of the Exodus memory. He grew up tending sheep. He grew up with a sling and a harp in an open field and a God he knew personally from the long hours of solitude that shepherd work creates. He had no record in his personal history of standing before something impossibly large and losing. He had a lion. He had a bear. Both of them had come for what was under his care. Neither of them had survived the encounter. When he looked at Goliath, the data set he was running did not include 40 years in Egypt. Did not include 40 years in the wilderness. Did not include the report of 10 men who had looked at walls in Hebron and chosen the word grasshopper. He was running a different calculation entirely. This is not a story about the virtue of ignorance. It is not a story that says knowing your history makes you weaker. The 40 years in the wilderness were necessary. The slow process of letting Egypt die out of the people was not a detour. It was the only road. But David stands as the proof that the road had an ending. That the calibration could, given enough time and enough grace and enough generations, finally exhaust itself. That the child of the grasshoppers could produce, eventually, a child who had never heard the word applied to himself. And that child could cross a valley that an army could not. Now consider Caleb again. He was one of the 12 original scouts. One of the 2 who refused the grasshopper language at Kadesh Barnea. He was 38 years old when he stood before the assembly and gave the minority report. He spent 40 years waiting, watching the generation of Egypt die in the sand around him. Watching the people he had tried to lead choose, in one devastating night, to remain exactly who they were. He did not become bitter. He became patient. At 85 years after the Jordan crossing, after Joshua had begun the work of entering the land, Caleb came to Joshua. And the words he spoke in Joshua chapter 14 are among the most remarkable in the entire Hebrew Bible. He said, "I am still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. My strength now is the same as my strength was then, for warfare, and for going out and coming in." 85 years old. The strength of a 38-year-old military commander. Preserved through 40 years of wilderness. Preserved through the specific discipline of waiting for something that had been promised without any visible timeline for its fulfillment. "Give me the hill country," he said. "Give me the hardest thing on the map. The thing that broke 10 men in an afternoon. The city whose walls said you cannot reach us. The ancestral home of the lineage that should not exist. Give me Hebron." And he took it. There is a pattern here that the full sweep of this history makes impossible to miss. The things designed to make you believe you are a grasshopper, the walls, the giants, the bloodlines that survived what should have destroyed them, do not actually determine the outcome. They determine the timeline. The Anakim were real. The obstacle was real. The scale asymmetry was real. But Hebron fell. Bashan fell. Gath fell. The valley of Elah went quiet. Not because the obstacles diminished. Not because the bloodline weakened. But because the people approaching it had finally, at the cost of 40 years and 1 generation, stopped measuring themselves by what Egypt had told them they were. The wilderness was not the punishment. The wilderness was the treatment. And the treatment worked. It just took longer than anyone hoped. It usually does. The line from Genesis 6 to the Valley of Elah is not a straight one. It bends. It goes underground for generations. It surfaces in Hebron and in Bashan and in the coastal cities of Philistia. It produces warriors and kings and one champion who stood in a valley for 40 days and called out to an army that was still learning to see itself as something larger than its history had prepared it to be. And it ends finally, decisively, without ceremony, with a smooth stone from a brook outside Bethlehem. But before we close this chapter, there is one more thing worth sitting with. The 3 words in Genesis 6-4. Wegam, acharei-ken. And also afterward. Those words were not placed in the text by accident. Nothing in ancient scribal tradition was placed by accident. The writers of these texts were not careless. They were careful to a degree that modern readers consistently underestimate. They chose every word. They preserved every genealogy. They tracked every name and every city and every migration of every significant people. And they left those 3 words in the Nephilim passage. Right there. In plain sight. Quietly admitting that the flood did not end everything it was sent to end. They left them there for a reason. The most generous reading of that reason is that they were being honest. That the tradition they were preserving required them to record what the record showed, that the contamination survived, that it adapted, that it reappeared in Canaan in a form recognizable enough that 12 trained scouts reached across centuries of theological history and called it by its oldest name. The more unsettling reading is that they knew exactly what those 3 words meant for everything that came after. That the 40 years in the wilderness, the conquest of Canaan, the battles of Joshua, the fall of Gath, all of it made a different kind of sense when you understood that the flood had left something unfinished. That the resolution was never going to be water. That it was always going to be a person. In a specific valley. At a specific moment. With a specific stone. So tell me in the comments honestly. When you read it also afterward in Genesis 6-4, do you read it as a scribal oversight? A grammatical remnant that survived the editing process by accident? Or do you read it the way I read it? As the most deliberately placed phrase in the entire passage. As the quiet, controlled admission that the story did not end where everyone said it ended. That the full resolution required not a flood, but a generation finally free from the program that Egypt had installed. A generation that looked across a valley and did not perform the ancient calculation. That did not ask, "Am I prey?" Where do you land on that? Because the answer changes what you think the wilderness years were for. It changes what you think Caleb was waiting for. And it changes what you hear in the silence of the valley of Elah after the stone lands in the giant falls and 40 days of taunting finally goes quiet. If you want to follow these hidden lineages further, if you want to go deeper into the texts that were removed, the questions that the canon left deliberately open, the threads that connect Genesis 6 to the New Testament to the world that most scripture studies never reach, subscribe. We are not finished with the bloodline of the Watchers. Not even close. The next chapter is darker. And it is closer to the present than most people are prepared for.